AI is going to be out there, but the ability to think is central to being a human. The ability to create, the ability to emote are things that are wonderfully human about us. If you want to be a senior leader, you got to act like an introvert at times and an extrovert at other times, is what an ambivert is. So be true to yourself, but be flexible a bit. Now, if you can't do that, you can't be a senior leader. We need to be mentored by young people so that we can do a better job and be in greater touch with today's turbulent world.
Welcome to the 1 Million Years of Joy podcast. I'm Dr. Andrea Benaker, your host, and my intention is to inspire you to find more joy in your life through the stories from our guests and the science on joy and purpose. Karl, you have an exceptional career. You've been with McGill for over 25 years. You've written multiple books. You have received the Thinkers 50 Leadership Award as well. You also have your own CEO series radio show, which is really, really phenomenal, while also being featured in some of the leading publications from Harvard Business Review to The Economist. In the shifting landscape of work and the expectations that employees have today, what do you believe needs to shift in the workplace in order to drive greater employee engagement?
Well, the world is changed and the generations have changed as well. So it's a combination of, it's changed for everybody, but particularly the Gen Zs, the younger millennials are pushing quite a bit of change. So I have a CEO radio show, as you mentioned, every week I interview CEO, and then I have a CEO class. So I probably sit down with 80 CEOs a year. Then I have 8 undergrads working for me. So I'm privileged to speak to older people, more experienced, and then really young people, the future. And it's a privileged position to do that I appreciate that McGill allows me to have. What are some of the key differences in the past is, one is purpose. So what we need is to provide our employees and ourselves with a greater sense of purpose, that our lives have meaning, that there's something beyond just making money. There's a very famous bumper sticker back as a boomer when I was working at IBM, "He who dies with the most toys wins." When I show that to my undergrads, they're just horrified at the shallowness of the boomers. Because I remembered, I'm not sure why we were so excited about it, but we measured ourselves by what kind of car we drove, what kind of suit we had, where we lived, and that was a measure of the person. Where today you go, that's really sad. And a car pollutes. And to measure yourself by that, it should be more measuring yourself by how little pollution you create. So my wife and I, we don't have a car. It died about 14 years ago. Yeah, I took it down to George's garage in Saint-Henri, where it's more frugal. And George is there. He's an older German guy with his grandson, and his son work with him. And we looked at our car, 97 Intrepid, and he looked like he said, "It's getting towards the end, Dr. Moore," referring hopefully to the car, not himself. And if in Texas, we probably would have shot the car to no practical purpose, but we got rid of it. We use common auto. To this day, about 14, 15 years later, we use car sharing because we're cheap, frugal rather, but we're also thinking about the environmental side of things. Now, we live down close to downtown, so it's a privileged life in that sense. But that sense of purpose, that you're doing good in the world, and the environment is a central part of that. So as a leader, your young people are thinking about that, but increasingly you're thinking about that. So when I interview CEOs, that's a central concern, is that sense of purpose, the sense of doing environmental things, EDI things, making the world more fair than it has been in the past. There also, a really big issue these days is mental health. So I started my radio show about 15 years ago, and I didn't ask CEOs how they kept in shape, but some of them had hot bellies. So I didn't want to embarrass the man. But about 10 years ago, I started saying, "How do you keep in shape?" And they all would talk about getting up. It was irritating, 4 a.m, going to their gym in their basement. And, didn't want to hear that. But about 2 or 3 years ago, I started asking CEOs, you need to think about the mental health of your employees, but what do you do for your own mental health? And they all spoke with considerable enthusiasm about mental health as an issue they got to think about. And Valerie Pisano, who runs Mila, she mentioned she meditates every day. And part of that was giving permission to everyone else, saying, here's a very successful woman, very well educated, doing well, running a big organization. but she takes time to meditate. Therefore, if she does, I should as well. So we're adding mental health of our employees and ourselves to that. So at McGill, we've got to be careful, rightly so, about microaggressions and things like that, where we might set students off. So we think about it more than we have in the past, and that's a good thing. And there's just that sense of that we're more concerned about our own and other people's mental health. So it's another big trend I see out there. A final big trend to mention is that it's the decline, but not death of hierarchy. That, way back in the day when I worked at IBM, we just get orders from people above us and we'd follow, and we almost literally might salute on occasion. But today, what we recognize is that that is an old school approach that just doesn't work. Partly is because, where do ideas come from? In the past, in an unchanging world, what I did 20 years ago is still relevant today. In today's world, what I did 5 years ago is increasingly less relevant in a turbulent world. Therefore, I've got to take a different approach to strategy. And there's two big schools of strategy. One is Mintzberg, who's here at McGill, a colleague and friend of mine. The other one is Michael Porter at Harvard. And I taught it last week, some of his ideas, the 5 forces and all. So it's still germane, but Michael's more top down, Henry more bottom up. And in a world of turbulence, bottom up makes sense because young people, frontline troops, they're what we call boundary spanners. They have a foot in the turbulent world, a foot in the organization, and they're not insulated from the world. So they give you feedback about your strategies, how it need to change, how it need to evolve. So when I ask CEOs, they say it's a combination of the two. The CEO is responsible for the direction and gets fired if it goes bad. And they build it with their team, they run it by the board, but increasingly they've got to listen to people throughout the organization for ideas and to adjust our strategy as we go along the way. It's a turbulent world, and now I say to older people, the world's gone nuts, and they all nod. But I can't say that to young people as it's too depressing. So the world's more turbulent is what we're dealing with. Trump, is president now. We look at what's happening in Ukraine. We look at what's happening all over the world. There's so many things going on that are astonishing by yesterday's standards. Though when we think about our grandparents, they went through the Depression, World War II. You and I, Andrea, have never seen anything as bad as the Depression, World War II. So that kind of puts things in perspective. Calm down a bit. The world is not that different than the 60s, 70s, and 80s in some ways.
I love everything you have shared, and I want to talk about purpose because, interestingly, a lot of the research we're doing within 1 Million Years of Joy is actually about exploring joy across generations, across cultures. And one of the key findings we have identified since the beginning is that individuals that have found their life purpose have actually a much higher level of joy in their life and life satisfaction. Going back to the CEOs that you speak with on a regular basis, have you seen some of these CEOs take on a responsibility to actually help some of their employees find their life purpose and dissociating that from the organizational purpose and actually connecting the dots between the two?
I think that's what's required of senior leaders. So a couple of years ago, I started asking in our MBA class, the CEOs, what's your purpose? When did you find it? And has it evolved? And this is probably the question the MBAs lean in the most. They want to hear what this very successful person has done. And there's often an evolution of purpose in a sense. And you might say to help others, but you get into more depth and more detail that makes you different than other people. But part of that purpose is helping young people find their purpose, and that may mean they leave your company. But if you do that, I want to work for you because you're going to do the right thing for me, regardless of the cost to the organization. But to my mind, that makes the organization, the leader, a winner because people are going to want to work for that person because that's the right thing in today's world.
And I fully agree with you. But how do you explain the reality that today, when you're looking at the global engagement of employees, Gallup keeps indicating that out of 10 employees, there's about 2 that are engaged. And even in the leading organizations that are really doing fantastic things and implementing beautiful initiatives that are creating engagement and so on, even those organizations just have 7 out of the 10 employees that are truly engaged. What, in your view, needs to change from a leadership perspective to actually elevate those numbers to a different level?
Well, something where I'm a professor talking the theory, but I talk to 80 CEOs a year, and this is one of the topics. And I'll start asking about joy, thanks to our conversation today. And it's something where we see an evolution, and it's the better leaders are doing that. But again, as CEO, you might have 50,000 people, so does it cascade down to the lower levels where young people tend to have first line or second line managers. They don't report to the CEO, and that's fine. That's normal for their career. It's getting the culture to do that, which is the big challenge. Peter Drucker said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. Strategy, you can come up with maybe McKinsey and BCG's help. You can do it with the C-suite. You need to run it by people, but you can do that. But it's changing the culture takes years often. So I think it's what we're seeing is just taking time for these ideas to really get there, percolate down lower, and change our culture.
And ultimately, that requires a whole transformation for all leaders across the organization. It's not just a CEO, as you just pointed out, that needs to believe in the power of purpose or mental health and embrace new practices. It's really about bringing that philosophy across the organization through every single leader, because ultimately they have a huge responsibility in taking care of their people. And I think that's something very, very different that has evolved over the years in terms of what is the role of a leader within an organization. And as you're thinking right now and connecting back to what you were saying about the younger generation, being careful with the language you're using, what are you seeing emerge as a result of the AI impact that is having on our work? And what are the key insights that you're gaining as a result of how AI technology can actually be implemented within the workplace? And even some experts say that my future manager is going to be an AI manager. What are your views on that?
Well, I ask every CEO in the last couple of years about big data a couple of years ago, and I started asking about AI. And 3 or 4 years ago, their board would say, "What are you doing about AI?" And you'd look them in the eye and go, "We're looking into it." And they knew you hadn't done much, but 6 months later, you would actually have looked into it. Where today it's spreading much more, and we use it as part of our lives. And companies tell me they're using it more and more to get right into what the company does. So there's that direction that's clearly going to occur. But it's also that there's a lot of uncertainty around a lot of ethical issues we hear about, rightly so. I have a new book coming out with one of my students who is now a law student, former student, about 23, 24-year-old. And I was going around showing 2 potential book covers. And it was interesting because many young people said one cover looked like it was generated by AI, and they said that disdainfully. Like, oh, gee. Like, you just said ChatGPT, give me a cover, and it did. And you didn't really put any thought into it, which is somewhat true. But they liked the other one. But no older person said that. Where the younger generation see AI as maybe threatening their careers and their lives and see it more negatively. Now, it's interesting because we don't allow you to use AI to prepare your term papers for myself and my colleagues. And what I say to students is that AI will undoubtedly help you in many ways. It helps me. But here at McGill, you're some of the smartest young people in the world. And I point out that I taught at Oxford for years. You're in the same league as Oxford and Cambridge. I taught at both. So that's true. I want you to learn as an undergraduate how to think. Because in the seniors' home 7 years from now, the ability to think will mean you'll be a better board member on the seniors' home you're part of. So the ability to think is a lifetime skill that is human, that AI can capture a bit, but in education we need to get them to keep thinking, keep communicating and writing and be able to express our ideas well. That this is a central skill of an educated person, we believe. But on the other hand, AI helps me on various things. When I ask questions at Google, it's AI answering, and you go, actually, that's fairly good. So it will be part of our lives. And undoubtedly, a long time ago, when pens came out, people said, no, we should use goose feathers. We have for our whole lives. But today we go pens. Like no one's going pens, they're just terrible. So technology comes along, like laptops and our phones. And when I get on the elevator at McGill, almost all the students are on their phone. Sometimes I'll tease them and go, I should be on my phone. What should I be doing? And they laugh because I'm teasing them. But, there's lots of things to do there. I wonder if they're going to go blind early or, lose their vision a bit because they're looking at a phone so much. So I'm worried about that as a parent. But AI is going to be out there, but the ability to think is central to being a human. The ability to create, the ability to emote are things that are wonderfully human about us.
And especially the ability to be empathetic, something that no machine will ever be able to do, correct? How do we sense the emotions? How do we read between the lines when an employee says everything's fine? So the words that are being conveyed are positive, but the body language actually shows something completely different.
Well, this is one of my concerns with Zoom meetings was I'm old school. I'd like to be in the same room. And I tell my students back in the day when I was working, twice I flew across the Atlantic just for an hour meeting. Because I needed to look someone in the eye and tell them bad news and see how they took it. And if they said, no big deal, I'll give them more bad news. But if they were really upset, I go, I apologize, I didn't explain it well. Where I need to see, for example, someone's foot is moving up and down, they're upset generally. So I want to explore why. But on Zoom, I can't see that. And so and even during the pandemic, I taught at McGill downtown in a big room empty, but I wanted the bigger screen so I could see students' faces better. But I also just want to be down here and run into people I knew, just to say hi. We'd stand with masks on, safely distanced. But it's that human contact. Now, I'm an extreme extrovert, so that's part of it. And I just wanted that human contact. But I prefer that ability to be across the table as we are now. On the other hand, I have a 16-minute commute from door to door, including 3 minutes on the metro, where many of our colleagues have an hour and a half commute, and they have small children. So if you can save 3 hours a day and spend it with your kids, I can understand why. But I have 16 minutes. So my bias as an extrovert is towards that, but I am blessed to have a short commute. So I have to be a bit more balanced than I might be about the topic.
And I know you've written a book actually about introverts and extroverts. Tell us more about that research, and what are the key advice that you would have for leaders in order to embrace these distinct differences and realities so we can actually foster greater engagement and collaboration?
Well, let me tell you the backstory, Andrea, that about 12 years ago, I wrote a review of Susan Cain's book, Quiet, with one of my undergrads, and it got over 66,000 views on my Fort blog, 1,000 times more than any other one. Like, it was just genuinely astonishing. We actually phoned each other at a time and said, there's another 5,000, just incredible levels of excitement. So the next day, Claude Mongeau comes to CEO class, McGill MBA grad who ran CN, 24,000 people. And I'd never asked anyone before, but I said, Claude, are you an introvert or extrovert? And he said, I'm a huge introvert. Went on 10 minutes in a quiet way about it. The second CEO was an introvert. So I'm astonished because the literature I was aware of said that leaders are extroverts. Now that was a bit old school, and it came from kind of Dale Carnegie and How to Win Friends, Influence People view of the world. We went from an agrarian society, like my father grew up on a farm, my mother in Saskatchewan, my mother in Northern Ontario in a lumber camp. But during the Depression, they moved to Toronto. In that case, they moved to New York, and they go, the skill set you need is that of the salesperson. The big personality is who we want. And that view has stayed to today to some degree. But when I looked into it, I started asking every CEO I interviewed, about 80 to 100 a year, are you an introvert or extrovert? And about a third 40% were introverts, about 40% are extroverts, so it's a bell curve, and about 20% were ambiverts. So, about 7 years ago, I found the word ambivert. It had been a US psychologist in the 20s. It largely disappeared. There was one article about 15 years ago about ambiverts and salespeople. And when I asked people ambivert, I remember I had about 20 rows with C-suite executives, and I was excited. I had a new word. And everyone said, what's an ambivert? And I explained, and everyone said, I'm an ambivert. And it was 20 people, and you go, statistically unbelievable. Like, it's not going to happen. What I realized is, and that insight that all 20 of them said I'm an ambivert, is saying if you want to be a senior leader, you got to act like an introvert at times and an extrovert at other times, is what an ambivert is. So what the book is entitled, We're All Ambiverts Now. So saying you got to act like an introvert at times, an extrovert at other times, but stay true to yourself. So it's something where there was some research done a long time ago at Harvard where they tested 4-month-old babies for their response to stimulation, which is the central idea around introversion and extroversion. Introverts love people, but too much stimulation, they tip over, take introvert breaks. Extroverts love stimulation. If they don't have enough of it, they take extrovert breaks and recharge by getting stimulation. So there's a hard wiring you have, and they followed the babies from 4-month-old for decades, and it was a reasonable predictor if they're more introverted or extroverted as an adult. So we have a hard wiring, but you got to act that part. Now, my wife's a grade 2 teacher, and around grade 2, you lose your name. You bring your daughter to school, your son, and we don't know your name, but you're Susan's mother. And if you get upset about it, the other parents go, listen, Andrea, you're taller, you make more money, you have more education, you win on every level other than cuteness than your grade 2 daughter. Let her be front and center. So being an adult means there's a time, just as if you have a husband or wife or a kid, there's times you got to step back and let them be the center. If you go to your husband's work and you are the center of attention, people go, it's so sad, he married poorly. What an ego. So there's a time that we all step back a bit. There's a time we step forward because it's the right thing to do in that context. It's your mother and father's 50th anniversary. You got to say something because you're their daughter and you've known them for your whole life, literally. So be true to yourself, but be flexible a bit. Now, if you can't do that, you can't be a senior leader, is what I'm arguing. And for more junior leaders, one out of 10,000 become a CEO. So most of us are not. I'm not a CEO, I'm not a dean. It's all right. I don't want to be. So it's something but if you want to grow as a leader, you learn to be flexible a bit, is the key message. And learn the strengths of an introvert. They're better listeners. So just shut up and listen, would you, once in a while, is what you have to say to an extrovert like myself. On the other hand, the extrovert is good at schmoozing. And Claude Mongeau gave a great lesson to me in my class. He said he was CEO, and they're going to make him CEO, maybe. They gave him an extrovert coach who gave him, among other things, gave him a clicker like a guy in a bar has a bouncer. He says 5 times a day, act like an extrovert, and you got to click. And at the end of the day, I'll phone you. This is an old story. And you need to have clicked it 5 times. So you say, I get the example, he gets in the elevator in the morning, instead of looking at his feet and ignoring everyone, he's got to go get in the elevator and go, oh, good morning, Susan. Maybe say it's cold or hot, and you're not going to argue if it's middle of winter, it's cold. And then say, loved your work last week, presenting the board, you killed it. Then get off the elevator because I remember her name, I remember and thank her for her work. But if I look at my feet and save us $100,000 as a good introvert, they go, oh, he hates me. I'm sending my CV to CP, our competitor in Calgary. That's an overreaction, but we tend to overreact. When the president goes by, he says, hi, Karl, and he makes me feel better because he recognizes me. This is part of the role of a senior leader, and you got to lean into that. So there's things where we can learn from the other, and we need to act like that on occasion to be effective. I know one introvert joke. Can I share it with you?
Yes.
So my mother's Finnish. So let me establish that. I know you're Romanian, but my mother's Finnish. And how do you tell a Finnish introvert from a Finnish extrovert? A Finnish introvert looks at her shoes when she's talking to you. A Finnish extrovert looks at your shoes. And I teach in Iceland Finn a bit, and they all laugh because they go, yeah, there's a humor to it. There's a bit of truth, where there's a cultural overlay as well. And so I'm actually, believe it or not, my students don't believe this, I'm actually much quieter in Iceland, but when I go to New York, actually I'm louder because that's New York for you. You got to make noise to be heard across, above the volume.
And as we're thinking about the introverts and the extroverts and the ambiverts, and the shift we've been seeing since the pandemic, where we were working from home, we slowly evolved into a hybrid model that seemed to be bringing a lot of delight and contentment to many employees. And now we're seeing a shift in organizations that are actually encouraging or imposing the return to the office. What are your views, and how do you believe these different types of personalities would react to such rules that are being imposed on them?
Well, I remember I wrote a Forbes blog, I can't take it anymore, how to cope with the lockdown as an extrovert after 1 week. and I wrote it with one of my students who had done the introvert book with me. And we agreed as extreme extroverts, we just couldn't take it. And you go, that's 1 weekend. Can you imagine a year and a half later what it was like? So there's something where the extrovert in me wants to be out there with people, and I would come downtown to teach an empty classroom to run into people, just as that I wasn't related to. So there's something where the extrovert and introvert have different needs along that line. And some we have to recognize that the extrovert's more apt to come in. On the other hand, there's the long commute, there's children to worry about, there's other things that are more important than just what the boss wants. And CEOs are more apt to be that noisy extroverted person at times who loves being with people and wants to see people, wants to do that. But you go, okay, that's fine for me, but let's realize other people that are wonderful and are great and bring a lot to the organization are not the same. So I think some flexibility is probably required there, and it's overstated to say everybody's got to be office 5 days a week. Maybe at a military base or something, but putting that extreme aside, I think they're getting carried away.
So Karl, you've written a book which is called Generation WHY. Tell us more about the research and the key findings as you wrote that book.
Well, the starting place was more philosophical, that people over 45 to the degree, you and I, were taught a modern worldview. People under 35 to the degree were taught a postmodern worldview, therefore it must be managed differently. And the book has 6 short chapters on imagined postmoderns, which are Zs and younger millennials. Now, if you're 34 and your sister's 35, you're not that different. But it's over 45 who are more apt to run the world, and under 35, which are going to be more junior people. There's that, just saying young people are taught at McGill. So I say to executives, mea culpa, I'm screwing up your workforce, a worldview, and it's things like, what is truth? How long does truth last? Who has truth? And heavy philosophical things like that we look at in the first half of the book, and just saying, look at young people just view the world differently than you do. That's why it's called a worldview. And if you understand the worldview, you go, largely I agree that there's less truth than there used to be. Like most would go, yeah, that's a fair point. But we need to see things from their lens in order to manage them successfully. And we call it Generation YWHY because they're forever asking, why are we doing things? Where I was recently dealing with a couple leaders, that one's retired recently, the other one's retiring this year, that if you ask why, they get upset because they are the boss, they made a decision. It's not up to you, even as a fairly senior person, to ask why in a polite, respectful way. But young people are asking why, and that's good because they're more apt to be in touch with today's world. And if I explain my thinking, they might go, that's great, but however, here you may be a little bit off. Therefore, they help me adjust my ideas and my strategies to be more effective in today's world. So it's more philosophical, but it gets down to things like one of the chapters is about reverse mentoring. So I say to my 20, 21-year-old undergrads, 30% of the time, you're mentoring me. And they're happy, big smiles. And I go, what's the flip side? And they almost never get it right. Is that 70% of the time, I'm mentoring you and don't you forget it? And they laugh because I'm somewhat teasing them, but I have a couple mentors in their 80s, great men. It never occurs to them to ask my advice because mentoring in that generation, our generation, was one way. Where in today's world, we need to be mentored by young people so that we can do a better job and be in greater touch with today's turbulent world. So one of the challenges, okay, for our age, we need to be reverse mentored. So we can do that, we call people in, and I know some CEOs have a strategy reverse mentoring group where they run their strategy by a bunch of 20-somethings and say, what do you guys think? And they adjust it and work with it, and you improve the strategy. The challenge for a 22-year-old is, okay, I should reverse mentor my boss, but she doesn't get it. So that's the challenge, is convincing them. I say, send one of my articles and just have them read it and go, hey, this is what my profs taught. Does it make sense to you? And most people would go, actually, when I think about it, reverse mentoring does make a lot of sense in today's changing world.
And reverse mentoring that's happening on a continuous basis rather than waiting for that monthly conversation or that annual review to actually have that. And actually, a lot of organizations talking about the annual performance reviews, those are also being abolished.
Well, they're going the way of the dodo.
Yes,
it's just
exactly.
like, I want, one of the things that young people want, this is one of the chapters in the book, they love feedback. And it's probably video games. Our son plays video games and they get feedback. social media, it's sad, but I look at how many LinkedIn likes I get up. It's one of the first things I do in the morning. It's sad, but I'll admit that to you. So they get feedback, and they get more feedback. My wife teaches great too. They get a lot more feedback than they did a generation ago. So they grow up used to feedback. They had helicopter parents. Then they get once a year. They want feedback. So when I was a manager at IBM, 5% of the time I'd worry about what am I going to say to you at the end of the meeting. Where today I go 10 or 20% of the time I'm thinking, Andrea, what should I say to her when we leave the room, and say, great job, but at one point you cut off that person when they were saying something important. You should have listened a bit longer. I know you're an extrovert, but you need to learn that skill a little bit. So I give them feedback all the time. So that's what a manager does, is spending more of their time giving feedback than in the past. Now, the intriguing thing is undergraduates will argue with my feedback. And you go like, this is unbelievable, but I'm giving them a lot more feedback. At a certain point, if they ask for more, I go, look, I'm making it up. Like, I'm just pulling it out of the air. I have nothing more to say. But there's a point where they rightly can go, I'm not sure. And then that's fine, because they're digging at what my thoughts are. One of the things I think you need to say increasingly as a leader, as a manager, is, what do you think? All the time. Say, here's what we're doing. What do you think? So that I can improve, micro improvements perhaps, but improve my strategy. And it's motivating because I'm someone who respects the opinions of other people and listens to them. But it gets me to do a better job in my strategy. There's a hard edge to that, which I love.
Me too, I love that. I want to talk about joy now.
Okay.
And there's research also that has shown that there is a joy gap at work. In other words, people going to work in their respective roles have an expectation that whatever they do at work would actually elevate their joy, but the reality is far different from that. What is the link that you have seen between joy and leadership to date?
What's interesting is I'll be asking this question of CEOs, and thanks for inspiring me to have a new question this year. But when you look at it, I know a lot of people my age are retired, and they're worn out because they worked long hours and they made a lot of money. They did well at it. They were promoted. They felt a sense of achievement that David Brooks wrote about in his latest book. That is, for a boomer, kind of the elixir of life. But at a certain point, they go, you're in your 50s now, calm down. Now, as a professor, I do CEO interviews, I teach, I write books with young people. Most of what I do, I enjoy, and it's a pleasure. And joy at times, but at least I enjoy it. Maybe it's a slightly level down from joy. But it's something where I'll keep working longer. My colleague Henry Mintzberg is well into his 80s, and he's writing his 23rd book or something. Partly is that you can get worn out by the sheer just producing things and getting up the ladder. So one of the things I try to teach my students is that what you want to find is something you love to do, something you're actually good at it. So I might love the tenor saxophone. I played in high school. I have one at home, but I'm not good at it. Like, just calm down. And third, what the world needs and will pay you, so you can support a family if that's part of your life. So I think finding that sense of that you love what you're doing and it's a pleasure. And I think, in your better moments, you're enjoying what you're doing, and this is work, but it's something you go like, I'm happy to go interview someone. It's fun. And that's what I do with CEOs. I have Antonio Park coming to class, the famous restaurateur. He's an old friend. It'll be a pleasure to talk with him for an hour with the students. Just a pleasure. They pay me. McGill doesn't have to pay me, but don't tell them, because it's a pleasure to do that. And that's what you want to look for and find. If you do find that kind of zone, you're more apt to find life of joy.
If there would be a recipe for joy, what would be the three main ingredients in your personal view?
Well, I think it's a matter of family is important for most people. Now, some people don't have a family, but most of us do. So that family connection, friends connection, which I notice more now as I get older, is that I'm just enjoying. I walk to work. So I walked with the CEO of Burke's this morning. So he's an old friend. Then yesterday, accounting prof, and tomorrow I think it's Andrew Molson. So I'm walking with people I've known for years. And with the CEOs, I'm learning from the conversation. Phil and I are just discussing McGill and life as it is. So I think friends are something that are one of the keys of life as well. After family being more important, but friends are really important. And I think the third thing is what we talked about, is finding a sense of purpose and joyfulness, that I'm good at what I do and it's valued and it's fun.
What are some upcoming projects that you're excited about?
Well, I have this book on introverts, ambiverts, and extroverts I'm doing with former students of producing my radio show, traveled with myself and a bunch of people to Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. She's now Osgood Law, so we have a book coming out. Then I'm working on a couple other books after that. One is, it's a sporting analogy. So I'm doing with a friend of mine from Darden who's a sports nut. And when you go from college basketball to the NBA, the game speeds up and you got to slow the game down. Now, Caitlin Clark was the top women's basketball player last year, but now she's playing with the big girls, if you would. And she said, she's still one of the best, but she goes, boy, they're good because they're more experienced, more mature, and it's something where the game is a different level, even for one of the best people in the world. So in the world of the corporate world, you go from star salesperson to sales manager, it's a different game. And then you go to second level manager to C-suite to COO to CEO, they're different games. So we're doing 50 interviews at each level at Bombardier, CAE, Couche-Tard, and so on, a bunch of companies, to figure out how do you make that transition successfully. So we're finding people that have done it in the last 2 years and how they slowed the game down. We have a bunch of questions to help organize those thoughts. So that's one book I'm working on, which is a lot of fun. That is, and I talked to an admiral. I was out at sea for 3 days with the Canadian Navy with 7 other leaders, opinion leaders, and talked to him about, he was retiring, about doing a book about how do you go from, now I know the Army, I should know the Navy ones, but from, you start off as a lieutenant, then you go to captain to a major colonel. And I remember I was talking to him in front of the other participants and the captain. I said, Admiral, is it different being an admiral than a captain? He goes, it's so different. And the captain leaned forward because he'd like to be an admiral someday, rightly so. And he wanted to know, like, how do I learn those skills so that I can show the admiral behavior? So they go, yeah, promote him. So it's an interesting question about what's the next step and how do you get there, which is a fun one that we're doing interviews right now in the midst of. And it's great. McGill provides me 3, 4 wonderful young people to do the interviews with me, and just marvelous.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And any final words of wisdom as it connects to leadership, joy, and life fulfillment?
Well, I think we're just less hierarchical. Stop worrying about your title and who you are, and be respectful of learning from other people. But you're still the boss and you can make decisions, but let people give you some input and don't be rude about it.
Karl, it's been an immense pleasure. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Always fun to talk to you.
Likewise.
All right.